Welcome to History Hack. If you didn't know by now, we are the revolution. That means we're sharp, witty, lots of fun, but it also means that we're essentially the peasants in Les Mis huddled round a table in the corner of the bar with no money. If you enjoy the show, please do support us. We have a Patreon account by which you can donate a small monthly sum in appreciation of what you're hearing. Alternatively, we have Ko-fi, in which you can just do a one-off donation as a thank you if you particularly enjoy a certain episode. Either way, we massively appreciate all of your support. Hope you enjoy the show.
Hello, welcome to another episode of History Hack. It's me and Christopher again. Christopher, who have we got on?
Afternoon, Alina. We have got the Angela Findlay, who is an artist and public speaker, and she's here today to talk to us about her first book, which is, I don't know, I say this a lot, but every now and then I get a book that comes across my desk that is absolutely amazing, and this one is one of them. It's titled In My Grandfather's Shadow. So, Angela, welcome to History Hack. I'm looking forward to talking to you about this.
Thank you. Likewise.
Okay, let's kick off and start talking about this book. I really want to know a little bit more about what was your grandfather's early life like?
So my grandfather was German. That's a starting point. And he was he was born in Plön, which is just south of Denmark. And he was brought up in a typical kind of Prussian military way. So he was, by the age of 10, his mother died when he was young, and he was a cadet in a Prussian military school where he was being instilled with all those things like discipline and honor and duty and obedience. And then by the age of 21, he'd already been promoted. He clearly came from a kind of military family, but or the family going back was military. And he was clearly a very talented kind of artillerist. And by the age of 21, he'd been promoted to lieutenant and served in a regiment in the World War I in the trenches in Arras and Ypres and all those kind of, right on the front line, and other places which I haven't really been able to research that much. Then he returned from the First World War kind of completely emaciated, with a lump of shrapnel in his neck and with a tail end of malaria. But then with that punitive Treaty of Versailles, which was designed to kind of keep Germany completely down and reduce it right down to the basics again, the army was reduced to 100,000 men, and my grandfather was chosen to be one of those men. So he was already displaying signs then as a very good artillerist. He was also an incredible athlete, and he won all sorts of prizes for long jump and high jump championships, horse riding, swimming, and he very nearly made it to the 1936 Olympic Games. But by that stage, he was considered just too old compared to this sort of emphasis on youth that Hitler had. So he was kind of all round designed for a good soldier, really, very athletic soldier.
I've got to add, before Chris jumps in with this question, that you're sitting in a room with a World War I historian, and we have an extensive amount of World War I historians under our hat. So if you ever need any help in that regard, then you can get in contact with one of them.
I would really love to research it. I just haven't been able to find much, but it also wasn't the emphasis of my research. There was so much to do otherwise.
I could just imagine your book, instead of it being one small book, you could have just done it in bigger parts. So, the middle, the beginning, the end, part 1, part 2, part 3.
The thing to say possibly about my book at this stage is that it's it is about 3 generations of my family. So it's looking at the kind of, my grandfather is one generation, my mother, German mother, is another, and I am the 3rd generation. And the whole book is kind of interweaving the 3 of us really into the wider story of Germany's World War II history. And I just say that because it isn't just a narrative of my grandfather's life or even my German family's life. It's how it plays right into the present as well.
What leads into the question of what, I know from the early chapters of your book, you talk quite extensively about this, but what was it that started you on the path of researching your grandfather's history?
Yeah, it was strange because I never met my grandfather. He died a week after I was born, and I grew up just with this photograph of a man in uniform, the face of a portrait of a general, basically, sitting on my mother's writing desk. And a few stories about him doing a handstand on his 60th birthday, and of him being this incredible athlete, and that he fought in the war. And we were brought up to believe that he wasn't a Nazi. But I always had, already as a little child, I can still see it in my mind's eye, I had this kind of abiding sense that because he died a week after I was born, that our paths had kind of crossed, him on his way up and out of life, and me on my way down and into life. And where our paths intersected, he handed me this baton. And I never thought anything of this. That was just how I knew my grandfather. And it was only much later in life that this baton, this image of a baton, would assume a huge significance and actually be the clue to the whole life. So it was then later I went through all sorts of kind of unexplained symptoms of guilt and shame, and one would have imagined from some of my behaviors that I might have been traumatized by something, but there was nothing in my life that really pointed to a big trauma. And then it was in 2004 when I saw the film Downfall about Hitler's last days in the bunker, which you're nodding so I can see that you've seen it. And it was, the weird thing was that I just cried, and I could not stop crying for 4 hours after that. And my companion with me, he kind of said, Angela, what are you crying about? You know, Hitler's dead, the Nazis are finished, the World War is over. What's there to cry about? But something in that film triggered something in me and got me. When I got home, I Googled my grandfather's name, and the first thing that popped up was a photograph of the moment actually of his downfall, the moment that he is surrendering to the Americans in North Italy at the beginning of May 1945. And that was the beginning. I knew then, I mean, it was just an extraordinary photograph that I'd never seen before. And that was the beginning of my search. I just set me off on this journey to uncover his life. And actually in doing so, I was uncovering what was going on in me as well.
I think a lot of people and a lot of our listeners can relate in one way or another, maybe not directly, for example, having the past of somebody from the German army. I mean, for example, in my perspective, my great-grandfather also, he was a general, he fought against both the Germans and the Russians actually in 1939. And you kind of, it's this long style, like you mentioned, it's a trauma. And we still don't understand it. And the trauma comes in various different aspects. So for Poles, it's the trauma of being, you know, the country being destroyed, the intelligentsia being destroyed. For you, it's a completely different type of trauma. But I think in a way, we can all sort of relate to each other. I don't know if that makes sort of sense of what I'm trying to say.
It makes complete sense to me. And all the people that I've talked to afterwards, I've had, since my book as well, I've been receiving letters from Jewish people, from Polish people, from German people, from all sorts of sides of the Second World story, who have come up to me and said, your story is my story, different circumstances, outwardly completely different. And even though I'm sort of coming more from the trauma of the perpetrator side, or the shame, let's put it that way, shame is also part of trauma, and it's the kind of the silence and the inner dynamics that go on with this kind of inherited story, this inherited bundle of stuff that isn't your own, but that definitely is part of you. So yeah, I can imagine that that lots of people can relate.
I love this. I love how open you are. Can I just say, I think it's absolutely fantastic. I love it.
Thank you. I've learned actually to be open, and it is the openness in a way that was my healing. It was with care, obviously. You don't just want to blurt out your own vulnerabilities and trauma, and it takes a huge process. I definitely wasn't open. It was terrifying, kind of coming out with some of this stuff, but now I'm further down the line. It's the openness that actually connects, I think.
You managed to get some letters from your aunt, which were written by your grandfather. What did they tell you about? Did they give you an insight into his career as a soldier and the experiences he went through?
Yeah, the letters were amazing, and I'm so grateful to my German aunt who typed them all up, because they were all in that old Zutterlin kind of German handwriting on little bits of paper, often in pencil words, kind of really tightly packed onto the page. And she typed them all out so I could read them. And they not only gave me incredible insights into the Eastern Front, because he was in Operation Barbarossa. He was in the kind of the front line of, well, not quite the front line because the tanks went front, but he was right there from the beginning in June 41, that massive invasion into Russia. And so they first of all describe the unbelievable conditions. It starts off with the dust, and then it turns into the freezing snows and the minus 50 degrees, and the soldiers are still in their summer uniforms because supplies can't get through. And then when the snow thaws, it turns into this unbelievable mud where horses sink up to their bellies in, and no cars, no supplies can get through. It also gives me insights into him as a man. So he's quite critical of some of the orders that he receives. He talks about the ridiculous orders from the idiots above. You get a sense of this man who's kind of leading his men with an unbelievable sense of discipline. He was also leading from the front, as I later heard from a man who who was in his division. One thing that I'm astonished by the bravery of these soldiers, what they're doing, sleeping in holes. Well, soldiers everywhere, really, but the distances, the vast distances that they're marching. And then it gives an insight into the partisan war, which was initially, I think it's what brutalized the Wehrmacht as well, because it went against all rules of warfare that they had been trained to do, and some of the descriptions of what the partisans did, even to their own in many ways, were just absolutely horrifying. But then you hear something like he talks about what the SS are clearing up behind, and that's when you realize that yeah, he was aware of this war of annihilation that I knew nothing about when I first read these letters, but then I learned more and more. I knew nothing about the Second World War, quite honestly. And then you learn about this war of annihilation, that it was from the beginning, that was the orders of the German soldiers to annihilate the Bolsheviks, the partisans, the commissars, and the Jews. And that's where it becomes very, very difficult reading, though I actually never hear anything anti-Semitic personally from my grandfather. For him, it is the Bolsheviks, the communists that need to be pushed back. They are the enemy, and he's got this job to do. Yeah, they are astonishing, at times deeply uncomfortable reading for all sorts of reasons.
I mean, you've touched on this already. I think we should expand on it a little bit more, which is the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. Because, for example, there were crimes being committed against the Poles, the Roma and Sinti. All sorts were happening. Like you mentioned, the SS, the Einsatzgruppen behind the German army, sweeping as they go along, committing mass murders and atrocities. I mean, everybody was getting it at that point. But how does your grandfather's experience this? Do you know if he experienced any of this sort of frontline massacres or frontline sort of face to face with these sorts of things?
I didn't come across any mention of kind of mass executions, of pits, of anything like that in his letters. That's not to say that he wasn't aware of them. I can't believe that he wasn't aware of them. But I try to think, and I don't know if I'm being idealistic or in some way in some sort of form of denial, but as a division leader and then later as a general, I feel that he there was so much to do on the front. I mean, there was lots of talks about artillery and about battles, and they got to the Battle of Volkhov, you know, which was part of the sort of the outer realms of the siege of Leningrad, and it's all about munitions and setting up log corduroy roads, as they called them, through the mud, and it was getting supplies, and it was meetings with generals and other people, and there was no talk of that. But many of his letters were lost as well, that has to be said. So either way, I don't know. But this myth of the clean Wehrmacht, that persisted. Certainly in my family, that was how I was brought up, that the Wehrmacht were clean. That was actually internationally recognized, wasn't it? After the Nuremberg trials had sort of declared, for all the reasons too big to go into, but they had declared the Wehrmacht kind of clean. I think they needed the Germans back on side to fight the Cold War as well. And then in 1995, this myth was kind of blown out the water with this Crimes of the Wehrmacht exhibition that was shown in Hamburg. And I remember my mother talking to her family on the phone, and there were just these flutters of panic going on in there as their kind of bubble was burst, and that just rocked so many German families who had kind of clung on to the last hopes of honor and goodness in their Wehrmacht relatives, and suddenly there was just photographic documentation and all sorts of other evidence that that wasn't the case. But as with everything in this whole horror story, there are nuances of knowledge, of participation, of culpability, of ignorance, innocence, knowledge, everything. It's I don't like to make clean sweeps. That's what I've really learned from writing this book.
I just want to add to this that obviously people that participated, who were part of the Wehrmacht and participated in some of these atrocities, for example, of course, I'm going to throw in the Warsaw Uprising, because not only were the SS in there, but the Wehrmacht were there committing atrocities. Nobody stood trial for any of these sorts of crimes, and it's very frustrating. So, for example, some of the commanders in the Warsaw Uprising, they just got away scot-free. It's mind-blowing for me.
Yeah, I agree. It sickens one to the core, actually, the whole idea that so many people got away. What I did also want to say about the clean Wehrmacht was that then there was also the resistance within the Wehrmacht, and the most important bit was the Stauffenberg assassination attempt in July 1944. And interestingly, I found out that my grandfather was approached to be part of this assassination attempt. And that shows already a certain element of trust of him being anti-Hitler. And he never joined the Nazi party, so he doesn't fall neatly into a category of Nazi. This is what I mean about the nuance, which you all know about. But he turned down the offer to be part of the assassination attempt because he considered it murder. He considered it not that a soldier's duty was to be apolitical. It wasn't. And I found this is almost the crux of one of my biggest questions. You know, there was a man who was later tried for mass murder of, thousands. And then he's got this morality that declares killing one evil dictator to be murder. And I find this dichotomy between the duty he clearly felt as a soldier, ingrained with this sense of duty and the oath that they'd sworn, they were bound by this oath that they'd sworn to Hitler, like soldiers anywhere, that they feel bound by duty. They're not allowed to be political. They can't choose the wars they want to find. So I find all that unbelievable, incredibly interesting, really, as a moral dilemma faced with facts of the situation.
Yeah, it was quite a common thing amongst the German officer corps that they'd personally given their word, because originally the oath was to the state, but now that it was to Hitler himself, and they felt that, well, I've made this my personal honor, my personal oath has been given, I can't betray that. And that comes back to, like, as you said, the Prussian military training a lot of them had before the First World War, and so that was sort of ingrained in them. They found it very difficult to mentally come to terms with it. That
Yes.
You're right, that this guy is evil. He's leading Germany. Germany itself is going to be destroyed. But I promised. It just doesn't.
Yeah.
To a modern man, it doesn't make sense.
And also, what I discovered much later in my research was that actually they even made a distinction between the soldiers, and Germans in a way made a distinction between Hitler, who was the kind of father figure in a way of the fatherland, the leader, and then all his kind of SS henchmen, so the Himmlers and those were the kind of rotten eggs. So there was not Hitler, and that's what came out in the letters that my grandfather wrote when he was a prisoner of war, which I think we'll come to. But that I found also really, I haven't quite understood how that comes about, but anyway.
Oh, I can quickly jump down a rabbit hole about how the Nazi state is run and how it's perceived, but that's for another time.
Get yourself back on track, Chris. Back on track.
Yeah, I'm getting there. I was just winding up. So, talking of Nazism, how much, because it pervades everything in 1930s Germany. It's literally everywhere. How affected was your family by Nazism?
Yeah, so that is my grandmother died in before I was able to ever properly ask her. When I used to ask her about her life in the war and in Nazi Germany as a child, she'd very quietly, carefully changed the subject. She was really, that her experiences were wrapped in the silence that so many Germans were and still are actually to this day. So I don't know from her point of view. Neither ever joined the Nazi Party, but the children, my mother born in 1934, just a year after Hitler came to power, or the year, I can't remember exactly, or became chancellor, she would have been exposed to Nazi education from the very, very start. So every single subject was infused in this Nazi ideology and this racial hierarchy, with the Aryans at the top and the Jews as and the Romani as the kind of absolute Untermensch. They were taught in geography about the geopolitics of how Germany had a bigger population per landmass. So there was this need for Lebensraum and the expansion to the east. They were, what I find the most insidious was that the children were told, not only through education, but through all the little groups like the Hitler Youth, they were taught to be hard as Kruppstahl, which was Krupp was the maker of steel, and how they weren't allowed to show emotions. Showing emotions was seen as weakness, and I think this really suppressed the development of these young children who were being shaped and molded from every single direction into good little Nazis who were going to produce children and keep the home fires burning and provide homes and soldiers to fight. And they were all instilled with this devotion to Hitler and this whole personality cult. And I do see traces of that in my mother. I think as an artist myself, the realm of what I call the soul, and anybody can take it how they want, but the sort of our inner world where creativity often springs from. I think for many of these young children, it was kind of snuffed out in the bud. It didn't develop, and that left this kind of void. And then, of course, there were, then later came the bombings and the lack of food, and eventually the flight of my family from their home just outside Berlin, a place called Jüterbog, and fleeing from the approaching Soviets, who were, and with this approach of the Soviets came the rumors, which weren't rumors actually, but of these mass rapes of children and women, anybody from the age of 8 to 80 as vengeance. So
oh yes, and they swept their way from 1944, even 1943, all the way through Eastern Central Europe, all the way to Germany, and did the same thing that they did over there that they did in Germany. And it was beyond horrific. I mean, women had to dirty themselves up so they looked like old women, or the men would hide, if there were men in the family left, they would hide people in the basement, like their wives and their daughters. It was horrible, absolutely horrible. And the thievery and the stealing and being looting. I mean, wow, hold on. Isn't that what's happening in Russia right now? Sorry, not going down a rabbit hole, but they were doing exactly the same thing back then that they're still doing now, and it hasn't changed.
no, it's horrifying. I think this repetition of history, which is another reason I wrote the book, because if we don't really identify what are the lessons, and if we don't talk about these kind of things and learn the lessons, we're always going to be in danger of repeating them.
What was your mother's experience of the home front during the during war?
So I think school continued for quite a while, though sometimes interrupted by these bombs, and I think it was a relatively happy childhood in a way, because they were a very close-knit family, a loving family. But my mother did have stories of things like walking into the local shop opposite their house, and she just said good morning, and there was a teacher in there, one of her teachers, who said, "Why didn't you say Heil Hitler?" And she said, "Well, my mummy said that we didn't have to people that we knew." Well, the teacher went off and reported this, and shortly after, the Gestapo came and arrested my grandmother, took her off for questioning. And it was really only the fact that my grandmother could say that her husband was fighting on the front, that he was a Wehrmacht officer fighting on the front, that she was released. That was how easy it was to kind of be caught out and taken away. So there were all sorts of little stories like that of her, but I think the worst one was the flight, when suddenly the Russians had reached Cottbus, which was about 40 miles from their home, and they were making incredible advances. So my grandmother decided to send the 2 youngest children, my mother and her younger sister, off to live with the grandparents in the west of in the northwest, north of Hamburg, in Schleswig-Holstein. And my mother and her little sister were woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning, very quickly told to choose a doll, and then off they went to this station. And there, I think, my mother's sort of main trauma happened, with her fleeing these heaving stations with everybody trying to get out. Berlin was bombed and in ruins and in flames, and the two children were kind of shoved through the window, and off they went, not knowing if they were going to see their mother, older sister, older brother, father, anybody ever again. And I think that was an incredibly traumatic moment at the age of 10 years old. And then later, weeks and weeks later, that was in February 45, and I think in about late April 45, the mother and the older daughter locked their front door, and with just the suitcases that they were carrying, left, and lost everything, leaving the older brother, the 15-year-old son, operating on these 88mm flat guns, shooting down. I mean, when you see pictures, he looks like a little boy with these dressed in these uniforms, and with his little mates shooting down the aeroplanes and experiencing horrific things for a 15-year-old, but believing they were fighting, they were an important part of fighting for the Nazi, the Third Reich and Vaterland.
Which again loops back to Downfall, but you have the scene. It's for me, it's one of the high points of the movie is the Hitler Youth manning the flak gun in the streets in Berlin, and they're just boys, and the lieutenant who's clearly like 18 himself, and the wounded soldier, one of the boys' fathers comes out and he's like, "You are all going to die," but yet they're all sat there ready to do their duty, and it's just horrifying. I saw the pictures in your book, and it was just, you're right, they're just children. It's just heartbreaking.
I was thinking, funnily enough, exactly the same scene as you were speaking. That's the only thing that was just going through my mind. These little boys with the helmets, the heads can't even fit into it, oversized military clothing. It was just awful.
And some of them were really, really vicious as well, because they were so indoctrinated in this as well, and had no, they were just sort of feral really. And I think that's when sort of being a perpetrator traumatizes as well, doesn't it? These sort of little children doing these unspeakable acts and witnessing the level of death. I mean, my uncle, I think his commander got blown up and his arm landed on his lap. You know, it was sort of things like that you wouldn't recover from easily, I don't think. But he did survive.
For your grandfather, the war ends in Italy, coincidentally when my grandfather's war ended as well, and he becomes a prisoner of war. But what were his experiences as a prisoner, and then coming back into sort of the post-war Germany?
This was, I think, where my grandfather's kind of he sounded kind of okay when he was fighting, when he sounded almost in his element as a soldier. I think he was doing what every soldier is trained to do, to a degree, and other things. But and then his downfall. So he surrendered. He was put in charge of 150,000 German prisoners of war in the north of Italy, in Rimini, and I think just in outdoor camps, barbed wire camps. And he tried to appeal for slightly better conditions like soap for his men, and got very angry that the Geneva Convention, the rules or whatever of the Geneva Convention, weren't being adhered. And clearly nobody was interested in treating German prisoners of war well. So Italy wasn't too bad, but then once he got, after about a year there, he got sent to Germany, to 2 different prisoner of war camps under the British. And that's, I think, where the real humiliation began. He was still in uniform over a year after, still in his uniform. They lost huge amounts of weight. The cold, the winters of 46 and 47 45 and 46 were incredibly cold. They had little tiny log burners, often running out of fuel. Many people he knew kind of committed suicide. He was outraged by the news that he was getting of what was happening to the Germans, who were all fleeing. His whole world was falling apart. Everything that he'd been fighting for really was falling apart. And above all, he had this massive smoking addiction to tobacco, and so both his war and his imprisonment were kind of hugely impacted by the amount of tobacco he had or didn't have. That kind of infuses all his letters. It was all uncertain. They had no idea of how long they were going to be kept. I think the army were kept till the last. The Luftwaffe and the Navy were tried first, and then the army. And in 1948, he was eventually tried for Nazi war crimes. He was accused of being a militarist and a danger to society and a National Socialist and stuff. And eventually he was found not guilty on all counts, and he was released in 1948. And that's when he returned home a completely emaciated and broken man. And he ended up kind of whittling yo-yos and selling them from door to door, and growing and selling tomatoes, and basically smoking himself to an early grave.
Can I just ask, what was it like? I'm assuming you did read the court testimonies and the trial and everything else. How did you feel having to read through all of that?
I watched so much footage and read so many books, both novels and fact and documents, and of course, and all of it just so unbelievable and horrific, and I cried many tears, and still can, actually, reading some of these accounts, and they're still coming out, aren't they? They're all the time, these accounts coming out. I don't think there's anything that makes it less awful, nothing that I've found that makes it less awful, reading and hearing and imagining what went on. And then I remember in Budapest, when I was in the War of Terror, no, there's a museum called something like the Museum of Terror or something like that, and I was watching yet more footage of emaciated corpses being shoveled into pits, and there was something inside me that just went, okay, stop, you've looked at this enough, you don't need to look anymore, you kind of know what went on, and to continue to look at this stuff is not going to help anything. It's certainly not going to help you anymore. And that's when I did kind of gently close the book on making myself try and face all of this. I think it was becoming incredibly detrimental. That doesn't mean to say I'm now closing my ears, but for my own sanity and health and ability to kind of recover from this and be a functioning human being, I had to sort of stop. And I still do watch things. I still find the subject infinitely fascinating, but I do it now more as a way of informing myself of new perspectives.
Trying to put my thoughts into words. It's very difficult. Germany as a whole, and Japan as well, they've had to deal with, it's referred to as war guilt, and it's sort of pushed down onto following generations, and it's very difficult for people to sort of say, well, try and think about what their grandparents were involved in, or if they were involved at all. But there's a kind of collective guilt.
I think this collective, there was a kind of collective denial, first of all, and then there was a kind of collective silence or denial at being accused of complicity, and then there was this collective silence that descended over Germany, and then this kind of collective trauma and guilt and shame, and this really potent cocktail that nobody knew how to deal with. It was too horrific and too painful, really, to talk about, to admit that there might have been a Nazi in the family, or that there was a full-blown Nazi in the family. And I think that's to a degree still going on today on a personal level. But in the 80s and 90s, sort of after the reunification of Germany, I think partly under pressure, and partly under pressure of the Allies, and partly under pressure of the younger generations, right from the late 60s, kind of, there was this pressure to break the silence and to talk about it. It was seen as this silence, and the fact that so many former Nazis were back in positions of power and enjoying successful second careers. It was kind of untenable for younger generations. And that's when I think people started, the country as a whole began this process of what they call Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which is sort of the coping with, or the trying to, the overcoming, or the dealing with the past. And I think that's when the artists really came with it. I think it's that the artists led this movement of trying to create these memorials, this counter-memorial movement that, unlike all our memorials, which look to things that basically remember things we want to remember and that we want other generations to remember, Germany's whole culture went into remembering everything that they wanted to forget, everything that people wanted to move on and leave in the past, and not only remember it, but apologize for it and atone for it. So this extraordinary culture infused this whole Vergangenheitsbewältigung, kind of infused every layer of society, cultural, historical, educational, and increasingly so with the third generations, which is what I am, the kind of, or what I call myself, the grandchildren generation, who have a bit more distance to the whole thing. That's now being processed more on a personal level, but it's been a massive question, and I think there's still a lot of blame coming from other, people often said to me, oh, they all knew, they're all responsible, talking about the whole collective German population. But as I swung between, yes, of course they all knew, and then I swung between, well, no, I looked at kind of today, what do we know? My other career was working in prisons, and I give lectures about prisons and how the arts can work in prisons. And the response I get to all the horrific conditions of our prison service, prison system, and the issues of prisoners, and everybody says, gosh, I had no idea. And that's with media outlets full of stuff about, we've got so much access to what's going on in prison, and everybody in this country lives probably not more than 40 miles away from the nearest jail, and yet nobody has any idea of what's going on in them, let alone, partly because they choose not to, and let alone doing anything about it. So I sort of apply the same thinking of, we are all getting on with our lives primarily, and horrific things are happening in our world that touch sort of all that come quite close to our world, and yet we're not doing anything about it. How difficult it would have been in those times to stand up or do something about a regime that would very likely kill you if you did do something. So I do ask myself the questions that are, what would I have done, and what do I do in the face of these injustices going on in the world, to a much lesser degree, of course, at the moment anyway.
Which would come out in Carl's letters, where he said he's concentrating on artillery needs, the fact he hasn't got any tobacco, what his men are going through, and he's just not thinking about what the SS are doing, or the Einsatzgruppen, or his concern is, I'm concerned about my men, I'm concerned about how I'm fighting the war. I know it's happening, but that's happening over there, and I don't need to think about that because it's nothing for me to think about.
Yeah, and I think there was a very, very good book called Soldaten, or Soldiers, by Sönke Neitzel, I think it is, and Harald Welzer. I might have got that wrong, but and in it they also find that most of the soldiers, the conscripted soldiers, or they weren't fighting an ideological war. I never found the ideology of Nazism sort of infiltrating my grandfather's letters. It was a war that they had to fight, and the soldiers the same. They discovered in all these letters and recordings of these soldiers that there was actually very little sort of passionate ideological kind of fervor or sort of goals. In the SS, completely different. That was something very different. But in the ordinary soldiers, they wanted promotion. They were talked about the last battle, their little moment of bravery, their homesickness, their friends, their all those kind of things that soldiers the world over probably do talk. So yeah, it's complicated.
You briefly spoke about, we spoke about it a little bit more extensively than briefly. but your mother was indoctrinated into the Nazi ideology. She was very young. She went through school. So talk us through a little bit how your mother's trauma of all of this affected you.
Yes, I mean, my mother was sort of 10 years old, really. So she, whether she was definitely influenced or impact. She was infused with, yeah, and probably indoctrinated is the right word. And I think growing up, my mother was a very, very loving mother, but there was something about her that was both a kind of vulnerability and a void that we as children would often bump up against or fall into, this sort of either an emotional void, or it was almost like a hard wall. And I think it's that I can only explain it as a kind of the frozen feelings in trauma. Things are frozen in time, emotions, the moment is kind of frozen. And I think sometimes I certainly bumped into this frozenness, this lump of something that was impenetrable. And being quite a sensitive personality that I am, and kind of artistic, feelings are very important to me. And I think that kind of caused problems between us. It caused a kind of clash. I kind of wanted to shake her into feeling things like I did, or like I thought everybody should or would. And that caused clashes, I think, big clashes. And also I think the sense of the Nazi ideal, that there is even a hierarchy, that there is a kind of level of perfectionism that people should strive to achieve. I think that is really difficult to shake off if you've been given that. And all my siblings, we all fought against that. We didn't want to be at the pinnacle of the top of the pile. We didn't want to belong to that club. And so that and then not belonging to that club caused kind of feelings of failure, or we were made to maybe feel inadequate or failure or whatever. And it took quite a long time to unravel that and to gain a sense of self-worth, of being just who we were without having to be this ideal. So I think those two elements really kind of impacted and led to kind of problems like, you know, depressions and dipping in and out of different addictions and low self-esteem, that kind of thing, all of which shaped me in a way. But I also feel, in retrospect, quite a lot of gratitude that I was given this kind of knotty biography, or this lump of really potent stuff to unravel, because it led to a huge amount of personal growth, I think, for which I really am very, very grateful for.
So yeah, Angela, this has been, like I said at the beginning, it's such an amazing book. It's reading it was such a journey, and I think we've only just sort of scratched the surface in the 40 odd minutes we've been chatting. But would you mind reminding us where the title of your book and where they can get it from, please, and when it's out?
So the book is out already in hardback. It's called In My Grandfather's Shadow, and it's published by Penguin Transworld and Bantam Press. It's out, I think, in all outlets, all major outlets, or can be ordered from any bookshop. And the paperback is coming out at the end of April.
We'll get it on the History Hack bookshop as well. That way the podcast will get a tiny slice of money, and you'll get a larger slice of money than if it goes through Daft Amazon.
Right, lovely, thank you.
It's all good.
Angela, thank you so much for joining us. It's been really great. I loved it, and the book is now on my Amazon wish list. Even though we're trying to not give money to Amazon, it's the only way I can get books over into Poland. So
it's been a real pleasure talking with you both. Thank you so much for having me on.
Our incredible guests give us 45 minutes of their time to join us and talk about their work or their new book. This is just a small taster. As a result, we have launched our very own bookshop on bookshop.org, where you can find our guests' latest books, you can support them, and you can support us on History Hack. 10% of every sale via our bookshop supports the podcast and allows us to keep going and bring you more top-of-the-line guests. You can find our bookshop at bookshop.org/shop/history hack, or search for us in the shop section. Thank you so much for your continued support. We really appreciate our listeners and supporters. So make sure you get down to the bookshop and grab yourselves a new book.